They thought making her kneel would entertain the room, but before the night was over, every smiling face would be forced to confront the true price of disrespect. Naomi Carter lowered herself onto the polished Italian marble floor as hundreds of glittering eyes watched in silence that felt louder than laughter. The crimson wine spread across the flawless surface like shattered glass beneath the golden glow of crystal chandeliers, reflecting diamonds, designer heels, and perfectly tailored tuxedos. Her fingers tightened around the white linen cloth she had been handed only seconds earlier, her heartbeat steady despite the humiliation pressing down on her shoulders. She had cleaned luxury homes for nearly 6 years, and she understood one lesson better than anyone else. Wealth could fill a mansion, but it could never guarantee kindness. Tonight, inside Ethan Castellano's legendary estate overlooking the Atlantic shoreline, kindness seemed to be the rarest guest of all. "Well," a sharply dressed woman said with an impatient smile. "You're the maid, aren't you? Clean it up." Soft laughter drifted through the ballroom. Someone quietly lifted a phone, pretending to check a message while secretly recording the moment. Another guest whispered something that earned another wave of chuckles. Naomi kept her eyes on the marble. She had learned long ago that some people searched desperately for a reaction because cruelty was meaningless without an audience. She would not give them the satisfaction. Slowly, she pressed the cloth against the expensive floor, careful not to leave a single streak behind. The scent of imported roses mixed with aged oak and expensive perfume filled the enormous room. A string quartet continued playing as though nothing unusual had happened. Champagne glasses clinked. Conversations resumed in hushed voices. Only Naomi remained frozen in the center of the ballroom, dressed in a simple black housekeeping uniform that seemed almost invisible against the ocean of luxury surrounding her. No one bothered asking what had really happened. No one questioned why the wine glass had slipped from another guest's careless hand before crashing beside her cart. Blame had settled on the easiest target within seconds. It always did. Naomi quietly reached for another cloth as a tiny splash of wine stained the cuff of her sleeve. She could already imagine calling her mother after work, pretending everything had gone smoothly, laughing through the exhaustion so her family would never carry the weight she carried every day. That thought alone steadied her breathing. Across the ballroom, hidden behind a wall of security monitors inside a private observation room, Ethan Castellano stood perfectly still. At 6'3", dressed in a charcoal suit that looked almost black beneath the dim lighting, he watched every angle displayed across dozens of high-definition screens. His expression revealed nothing. One security guard shifted uneasily. "Sir," he asked quietly, "should we intervene?" Ethan never looked away from the monitors. Every camera showed the same scene from a different perspective. Naomi kneeling, guests smiling, one man discreetly filming, another pretending not to notice. His fingers rested lightly against the polished edge of the console as another frame caught something none of the guests realized had been recorded. The truth had already entered the room. It was simply waiting for the right moment to be seen. Naomi finished polishing away the last crimson stain until the marble reflected the chandeliers once again, as though the embarrassing scene had never happened. She rose quietly, folded the damp linen cloth with careful hands, and stepped backward without lifting her eyes toward the guests. That simple movement, graceful despite everything, somehow unsettled several people who had expected tears or anger. Instead, they were met with dignity. She gathered her cleaning supplies and wheeled the small service cart toward the side hallway, disappearing behind carved oak doors where the music faded into a distant echo. Only then did she allow herself one slow breath. Her hands trembled for a moment before becoming steady again. She remembered her grandmother's voice from years earlier in Savannah, Georgia. "Never let someone else's bitterness become your reflection." Those words had followed Naomi through every difficult season of her life, from double shifts at hotels to overnight cleaning jobs that barely covered rent. They followed her now through the silent service corridor lined with polished brass sconces and fresh white orchids. Earlier that afternoon, she had arrived nearly 2 hours before the first guests, helping arrange floral displays, checking every crystal glass, making certain every chair stood exactly 2 feet from the next according to the event planner's measurements. She had admired the mansion only in passing. The sweeping staircase, the hand-carved walnut paneling, and the towering windows overlooking the Atlantic looked more like a museum than a home. Yet she had noticed something even more unusual. Every employee spoke about the owner with respect rather than fear. They worked carefully because expectations were high, not because anyone shouted. That detail had surprised her. During her first week, the head housekeeper, Mrs. Alvarez, had quietly offered one piece of advice. Mr. Castellano notices everything, even when you think he is not looking. Naomi had smiled politely, assuming it was simply another story told about powerful people. She never imagined those words would become important before the evening ended. Inside the observation room, Ethan Castellano remained silent as another security feed replayed automatically. Frame by frame, the sequence unfolded with perfect clarity. A guest laughing while turning too quickly, a careless elbow striking the wine glass, the crystal tipping toward Naomi's cart, the expensive vintage spilling across the marble before anyone reacted. Then came the part Ethan watched twice. 3 guests exchanged quick glances. One woman pointed directly at Naomi before anyone had spoken a single word. Blame had not been discovered. It had been chosen. Freeze that image, Ethan said calmly. The security technician obeyed immediately. The screen captured every expression in remarkable detail. Embarrassment on one face, satisfaction on another. Naomi standing completely still while everyone else decided her guilt without evidence. Ethan folded his arms. Save every camera angle from the last 15 minutes. Do not erase anything. Yes, sir. The technician hesitated before asking, would you like me to notify the event manager? Ethan shook his head once. Not yet. His voice remained measured, almost quiet, but everyone in the room recognized the change behind his composure. He was no longer observing a simple accident. He was studying character. Downstairs, Naomi returned fresh towels to the laundry station before helping another server carry dessert trays toward the ballroom. Nobody mentioned what had happened. Some employees offered sympathetic smiles. Others lowered their eyes, afraid kindness might draw unwanted attention. Naomi thanked each person with the same gentle smile she always wore. She believed respect could not depend on how others treated you. It had to begin with how you carried yourself when nobody stood beside you. Unseen by everyone below, Ethan watched her re-enter the ballroom on another monitor, noticing not the uniform she wore, but the quiet strength she carried with every step. The ballroom gradually settled back into its carefully choreographed rhythm, but beneath the polished conversations and graceful laughter, something invisible had begun to shift. Naomi accepted another silver tray from the kitchen, balancing crystal dessert plates with practiced precision as she moved through the sea of guests. Every measured step reflected years of experience. She never interrupted conversations. She never brushed against expensive gowns or tailored jackets. She anticipated every movement before it happened. Yet to many people in the room, none of that mattered. They still saw only the uniform. There she is, a familiar voice said with playful cruelty. The elegantly dressed woman who had ordered Naomi to clean the spilled wine raised her champagne glass toward a small circle of wealthy friends. Our evening's entertainment survived. Several guests laughed politely. One man smiled without looking up from his phone as he quietly replayed the video he had recorded earlier. You should post it, another guest suggested with a grin. People love those luxury party disasters. Naomi slowed for only a fraction of a second before continuing toward a nearby serving station. She heard every word, but her expression remained calm. Years earlier, her mother had taught her that silence was not always weakness. Sometimes it was strength waiting for the right moment. As she carefully replaced empty dessert forks with polished silver ones, an elderly gentleman standing near the window accidentally dropped his reading glasses onto the marble floor. Before anyone else reacted, Naomi gently set down her tray, picked up the glasses with both hands, cleaned the lenses with a fresh linen cloth, and returned them with a warm smile. Thank you, young lady, he said sincerely. You noticed before anyone else. I am happy to help, sir, Naomi replied softly. The gentleman smiled with genuine appreciation before rejoining another conversation, completely unaware that several nearby guests had watched the exchange with quiet amusement. She really thinks kindness changes anything, someone whispered. That is adorable. Another guest shook his head. People like her always believe hard work earns respect. The words drifted across the ballroom like invisible dust. Naomi heard them, but instead of lowering her shoulders, she straightened them ever so slightly. She had spent too many years earning honest paychecks to allow strangers to define her value in a single evening. Above the ballroom, Ethan Castellano continued watching through the security feeds. Every monitor revealed details the guests never imagined were being preserved forever. One camera captured Naomi helping the elderly gentleman. Another showed the same group laughing only seconds later. Ethan studied the contrast in complete silence. Character revealed itself most clearly when people believed nobody important was paying attention. Zoom in on table 12, he instructed quietly. The technician adjusted the image until the faces became perfectly clear. Ethan recognized every guest. Business leaders, investors, longtime acquaintances, people who spoke often about integrity while believing respect belonged only to those with status. He watched one guest casually forward the recorded video to someone else. Another leaned closer, smiling as though humiliation itself were sophisticated entertainment. Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Has the event manager seen any of this?" he asked. "No, sir," the technician answered. "Only security has access to these recordings." Ethan remained silent for several long seconds before giving another calm instruction. "Keep every file exactly where it is. Nobody deletes anything tonight." Downstairs, Naomi accepted another assignment from Mrs. Alvarez and walked toward the grand staircase, carrying fresh coffee service for the private lounge. Behind her, the laughter continued, growing just confident enough to mistake silence for victory. None of the guests realized the evening had quietly crossed an invisible line. They believed the story had already reached its conclusion. In reality, it had only just begun. Naomi climbed the sweeping staircase with the polished coffee service balanced carefully in her hands, each measured step echoing softly beneath the vaulted ceiling. Beyond the towering windows, the Atlantic shimmered beneath the fading colors of the evening sky, while inside the mansion every golden light reflected against marble, crystal, and polished walnut, as though perfection itself had taken residence there. She reached the private lounge outside the library, gently arranged porcelain cups onto a carved oak table, and quietly stepped back before anyone needed to ask. That had always been her way. Finish the work before anyone noticed it needed to be done. As she turned to leave, a middle-aged guest hurried through the hallway while glancing down at his phone. He clipped the edge of the serving table with his jacket sleeve, causing one delicate china cup to slide toward the floor. Without thinking, Naomi moved forward and caught it inches before it shattered against the marble. A few drops of coffee splashed onto her own hand instead. "I am so sorry," the man said, finally looking up. "That was entirely my fault." Naomi offered the same gentle smile she had worn all evening. "It is all right, sir. Nothing was damaged." Before the conversation could continue, the elegant woman from earlier appeared beside them with several companions. Her smile was perfectly polished, but her voice carried enough volume for everyone nearby to hear. "Be careful," she said lightly. "We already know accidents seem to follow her." Quiet laughter floated through the hallway once again. The businessman immediately looked uncomfortable. "Actually," he replied, "this one was my mistake." The woman dismissed his explanation with a graceful wave of her hand. "You are too kind." Her attention shifted toward Naomi. "Some people simply are not meant to belong in places like this." For a brief moment, complete silence settled between them. Naomi could have defended herself. She could have reminded everyone that the first incident had not been her fault either. Instead, she simply lifted the rescued cup, placed it back onto its saucer, and straightened the silver spoon beside it. "I hope you enjoy your coffee," she said softly before turning toward the hallway. Her calm voice somehow carried more weight than any argument could have. The businessman watched her leave with visible regret, while the others exchanged uncertain glances. Something about her refusal to answer cruelty with anger made the room feel unexpectedly smaller. Downstairs, Mrs. Alvarez noticed Naomi returning with the empty serving tray. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. Naomi nodded with a reassuring smile. "I have everything I need." It was a simple answer, yet Mrs. Alvarez recognized the quiet strength hidden beneath it. Some people survived difficult moments by fighting. Others survived by refusing to surrender their character. High above the ballroom, Ethan Castellano continued reviewing every camera angle in complete silence. He watched Naomi catch the falling cup before anyone else reacted. He listened to the hallway audio as the careless remark echoed through the speakers. Then he observed the businessman accepting responsibility while another guest immediately redirected the blame toward Naomi anyway. Ethan rested one hand against the edge of the console, his expression unchanged, but the security team had worked beside him long enough to recognize the subtle difference. His silence had become deliberate. He was no longer gathering information. He was measuring integrity. Every word, every glance, every decision made inside his home was quietly revealing exactly who each guest truly was. And the evening was approaching the moment when appearances would no longer protect anyone. Ethan Castellano stepped away from the wall of glowing security monitors without a single hurried movement. The room remained completely silent as he buttoned the front of his charcoal suit and adjusted the silver cuff links that had belonged to his late father. Every member of the security team instinctively straightened their posture. Nobody asked what he intended to do. They had worked beside him long enough to understand that the quieter he became, the more carefully he had already reached his decision. He glanced once more at the frozen image displayed across the largest screen. Naomi stood beside the serving table with calm eyes and relaxed shoulders, while several elegantly dressed guests surrounded her with expressions that ranged from amusement to quiet contempt. One frame captured something the ballroom itself had missed. The businessman whose coffee she had saved was looking at Naomi with gratitude. Everyone else was looking at her uniform. Ethan spoke without raising his voice. "Invite every guest to the grand ballroom in exactly 5 minutes." The head of security nodded immediately. "Should we announce another toast, sir?" Ethan gave a slight nod. "Tell them I would like to personally thank everyone for supporting tonight's charity gala." The instructions sounded perfectly ordinary, yet everyone in the room recognized that it carried unusual weight. Ethan rarely interrupted his own events unless something truly mattered. Downstairs, discreet staff members quietly delivered the message throughout the mansion. Conversations paused. Crystal glasses were lifted from polished tables. Guests smiled with curiosity, assuming another generous announcement or business partnership was about to be revealed. Naomi, meanwhile, was arranging fresh linen napkins beside the dessert station when Mrs. Alvarez gently touched her shoulder. "Mr. Castellano has requested that every employee remain inside the ballroom until his remarks are finished." Naomi looked mildly surprised. "All of the staff?" Mrs. Alvarez nodded. "Every single one." Naomi folded the last napkin with careful precision and quietly joined the other housekeepers, servers, and kitchen staff near the back of the room. She stood slightly behind everyone else, hoping to disappear into the line of black uniforms. It was where she felt most comfortable. Across the ballroom, the guests gathered beneath the towering chandeliers, their conversations blending with the soft notes of the string quartet before the musicians gradually lowered their instruments into silence. The enormous room settled into an expectant stillness. At precisely that moment, the carved walnut doors opened. Ethan Castellano entered alone. There were no dramatic gestures, no raised voice, and no attempt to command attention. He did not need to. His calm presence seemed to quiet the room more effectively than any microphone could have managed. Tailored in dark fabric that contrasted against the warm golden light, he walked across the marble floor with measured confidence until he reached the center of the ballroom. His blue eyes slowly moved across the faces before him, lingering for only a heartbeat on each guest before continuing. Several smiled warmly. Others straightened their jackets, eager to impress. Naomi remained near the back with the staff, her hands folded neatly before her, assuming his remarks would have nothing to do with her. She could not have been more mistaken. Ethan allowed the silence to linger just long enough for every conversation to disappear completely. Then his gaze settled, not on the wealthiest investor, nor on the evening's honored donors, but on the quiet woman standing among the employees. For the first time that night, every eye in the ballroom followed his line of sight. Ethan allowed the silence to settle over the ballroom until even the faint sound of crystal touching crystal disappeared. No one reached for a glass. No one whispered another word. His gaze remained fixed on Naomi for one final moment before slowly sweeping across the hundreds of faces gathered beneath the chandeliers. "Thank you all for joining me this evening," he said. Calmly, his deep voice carrying effortlessly through the room without the need for a microphone. This home has welcomed many remarkable people over the years. Leaders, entrepreneurs, philanthropists. Tonight, I believed I was hosting individuals who valued integrity as much as success. Several guests smiled politely, assuming another gracious speech was unfolding. Ethan continued without changing his measured tone. A few hours ago, an unfortunate incident occurred in this ballroom. I have heard several versions of the story. The elegant woman who had mocked Naomi exchanged a confident glance with her companions. One guest casually folded his arms, while another slipped his phone back into his pocket. Ethan turned slightly toward the enormous wall-mounted display normally reserved for charity presentations. Fortunately, he said, my home remembers every detail more accurately than memory does. At his quiet signal, the screen illuminated. The ballroom lights dimmed just enough for every eye to focus forward. Security footage filled the display. The first camera angle showed Naomi arranging fresh glasses beside her service cart. Another guest entered the frame carrying a nearly full wine glass, while laughing at something someone had just said. The crystal slipped from that guest's careless hand after brushing against the cart. Red wine splashed across the marble floor. Naomi stepped backward in surprise, never touching the glass. The recording paused. A murmur rippled through the ballroom. Ethan said nothing. A second angle appeared immediately afterward, revealing the same accident from above. This time there could be no misunderstanding. The guest alone caused the spill. Then the third recording began. Before anyone asked what had happened, the elegant woman pointed directly toward Naomi. Another guest nodded without hesitation. Someone laughed. Someone else lifted a phone to record. The footage continued without interruption, capturing every smile, every dismissive gesture, every comfortable assumption. Nobody spoke in Naomi's defense. Nobody asked for the truth. The only person who responded with dignity was the woman standing silently beside the stain. She had never created. Ethan allowed the final frame to freeze. The ballroom remained absolutely still. The businessman who had nearly dropped his coffee cup lowered his eyes with visible disappointment. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. One quietly exhaled as though realizing the evening had changed forever. Ethan faced the room once more. His expression remained composed, but there was unmistakable disappointment behind his steady blue eyes. It took less than 10 seconds, he said softly, for an innocent employee to become guilty in the minds of educated people who pride themselves on good judgment. Nobody answered. The elegant woman attempted a strained smile. Mr. Castellano, surely this has all been a misunderstanding. Ethan looked directly at her for the first time that evening. No, he replied with calm certainty. The accident was a misunderstanding. What followed was a choice. His words settled over the ballroom with quiet finality. Every guest suddenly understood they had not gathered for another toast. They had gathered to face themselves. No one moved. The silence hanging beneath the crystal chandeliers felt heavier than any speech Ethan Castellano could have delivered. The elegant woman who had spoken so confidently only moments earlier lowered her eyes toward the polished marble, as though the floor itself had suddenly become more interesting than the hundreds of people surrounding her. The guest who had secretly recorded Naomi quietly locked his phone and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Nobody smiled anymore. Ethan slowly stepped away from the presentation screen, his polished shoes echoing softly across the ballroom. Character, he said in the same calm voice, is revealed most clearly when there is nothing to gain from kindness. His eyes moved across the room before resting on the businessman whose coffee cup Naomi had prevented from falling. The man took one slow step forward without hesitation. Mr. Castellano, he said sincerely, I owe someone an apology. Before anyone understood what he intended to do, he crossed the ballroom until he stood directly in front of Naomi. Every guest watched as he lowered his head. Respectfully, Miss Carter, he said, you protected my mistake, and I allowed others to speak about you without saying enough. I should have done better. I am truly sorry. Naomi looked surprised. She offered the same gentle smile she had shown throughout the evening. Thank you, sir, she answered softly. I appreciate your honesty. Ethan nodded almost imperceptibly before turning toward the rest of the guests. Honesty, he continued, is never diminished by an apology. Pride is. His words settled over the room like quiet truth. One by one, several guests looked away, suddenly uncomfortable with their own silence. The elegant woman finally stepped forward, her confidence replaced by visible uncertainty. "Miss Carter," she began carefully, "I spoke without knowing the facts. That was unfair." Naomi listened quietly without interrupting. "I allowed assumptions to become accusations," the woman continued. "I regret that." Naomi answered with the same steady composure. "I hope tomorrow is kinder than today for all of us." The response surprised everyone. There was no bitterness in her voice, no triumph, only grace. A soft murmur spread through the ballroom. Even those who had remained silent all evening seemed unable to ignore what they had just witnessed. The oldest guest in attendance slowly began applauding. The sound echoed once, then twice, before another pair of hands joined, followed by another, until respectful applause filled the grand hall. It was not applause for wealth, influence, or the spectacular charity gala surrounding them. It was applause for dignity that had remained unshaken under humiliation. Ethan allowed the moment to unfold naturally before lifting one hand. The applause gradually faded. "Tonight," he said, "every member of my staff served this event with professionalism. They deserve the same respect that every guest expects for themselves." His gaze swept across the ballroom one final time. "Anyone who cannot extend that respect will not receive another invitation into this home." No one questioned the statement. No one argued. They understood it was neither anger nor impulse. It was principle, standing quietly among the employees. Naomi felt dozens of eyes upon her once again, but they no longer carried mockery. They carried something entirely different. For the first time since she had entered the mansion, the room was not looking at her uniform. It was looking at the strength of the woman wearing it. The applause slowly faded, but the feeling it left behind lingered in the ballroom like the final note of a beautiful song. Guests who had spent the evening discussing investments, luxury vacations, and exclusive opportunities now stood quietly with thoughts that had nothing to do with money. Naomi remained beside the other employees, hoping the attention would pass as quickly as it had arrived. Recognition had never been something she sought. She had come to work, earn an honest paycheck, and return home to the small apartment where her mother always waited with a warm meal and endless encouragement. That simple life had taught her something no grand mansion ever could. Peace came from knowing who you were before anyone else decided who you should be. Ethan Castellano looked toward the line of staff members one final time before speaking again. "Mrs. Alvarez," he said. The head housekeeper stepped forward immediately. "Yes, sir. Would you ask Miss Carter to join me for a moment?" Naomi blinked in quiet surprise. Every employee glanced toward her with encouraging smiles as she slowly walked across the marble floor. She stopped several feet from Ethan, careful to maintain the respectful distance she believed proper between employer and employee. "You wish to see me, sir?" she asked softly. Ethan regarded her with the same calm expression he had carried throughout the evening. "I do." He paused briefly before continuing. "When the wine was spilled, you accepted blame that did not belong to you. When you were mocked, you answered with dignity. When another guest nearly dropped a cup, you protected both the person and the property without expecting recognition. Then, when apologies were finally offered, you chose grace instead of revenge." Naomi lowered her eyes modestly. "I only tried to do my job." A faint smile touched Ethan's face for the first time that evening. "No," he replied, quietly. "You did something far more difficult than your job." The ballroom remained completely silent. Even the musicians listened. Ethan turned toward the assembled guests. "Many people believe respect is earned through status. Tonight, one employee reminded us that respect is earned through character." Naomi felt warmth rise to her cheeks. She had never imagined becoming the center of attention inside a room filled with influential people. It was almost overwhelming. Before she could find the right words, a young banquet assistant hurried nervously toward the front carrying a folded envelope. The young man hesitated before speaking. "Sir, I need to confess something." His voice trembled. "Earlier this evening I saw the accident happen. I knew Miss Carter was innocent, but I stayed quiet because I was afraid of upsetting the guests." He looked toward Naomi with genuine regret. "I am sorry." Naomi's first instinct was not disappointment, but compassion. She recognized the fear in his voice because she had lived with that same fear during her first years working in wealthy homes. She offered him a reassuring smile. "You came forward now," she said gently. "That takes courage too." The young assistant looked visibly relieved. Ethan noticed the exchange without saying a word. Once again, Naomi had chosen understanding over resentment. It confirmed everything he had observed through the security cameras. Strength did not always arrive with loud voices or commanding presence. Sometimes it appeared quietly, wearing a simple black uniform, carrying nothing more than honesty, humility, and the unwavering decision to protect the dignity of others even after her own had been tested. The ballroom remained quiet long after Ethan Castellano finished speaking, as though every person present understood that no additional words could improve what had already been learned. Outside, the Atlantic waves rolled gently beneath the moonlight, indifferent to wealth, titles, and reputation. Inside the mansion, something equally steady had settled into the hearts of those who had witnessed the evening unfold. Ethan looked toward Naomi once more before addressing everyone gathered. Beneath the chandeliers, tonight was organized to raise money for people we may never meet, he said calmly. That mission matters. But charity begins long before a donation is written on a check. It begins with how we treat the person standing right in front of us. No one argued. No one looked away. The message reached every corner of the room with remarkable clarity. Ethan then turned toward Naomi. Miss Carter, he said, if you are willing, I would like you to continue working here. Not because I feel sorry for you, but because integrity is something I value more than perfection. This house should always be cared for by people who possess both. Naomi's eyes softened with quiet gratitude. Thank you, sir, she answered. I would be honored. There was no dramatic celebration, only a simple exchange built upon mutual respect. Somehow, that made the moment even more meaningful. As the musicians gently resumed their performance, conversations slowly returned, but they sounded different now. Guests greeted employees with genuine smiles instead of hurried nods. Several servers heard sincere words of appreciation that had never been spoken earlier in the evening. The businessman who had apologized personally thanked every member of the service staff before leaving. Even the elegant woman who had judged Naomi lingered near the entrance for several minutes before quietly thanking Mrs. Alvarez for the work her team had done throughout the event. The mansion itself had not changed. The marble floors still reflected golden light. The crystal chandeliers still sparkled overhead. The ocean still stretched endlessly beyond the windows. Yet everyone walking through those halls carried something different than when they had arrived. They carried perspective. As the final guests departed, Naomi gathered a stack of neatly folded linen napkins and began restoring the ballroom to its usual order. Ethan passed through the room on his way toward the library. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Neither spoke. Words were unnecessary. Respect had already been expressed more honestly through actions than conversation ever could. Mrs. Alvarez smiled quietly as she watched them from across the room. It has been a memorable evening, she said softly. Naomi nodded while placing the last crystal glass onto the serving cart. Yes, she replied. It reminded me that kindness is never wasted, even when nobody notices it at first. Mrs. Alvarez smiled. Someone usually notices. Naomi glanced once toward the moonlit windows before returning to her work with the same calm dedication she had shown from the beginning. Nothing about her character had changed because others finally recognized it. That was precisely why it deserved recognition in the first place. Long after the music ended and the mansion grew quiet again, one truth remained brighter than the chandeliers that illuminated its grand halls. Wealth may open magnificent doors, influence may fill impressive rooms, and appearances may command attention for a moment, but only humility has the power to earn lasting respect. And on that unforgettable evening, everyone who walked through Ethan Castellano's home left remembering exactly what true dignity looks like.